Hi, friends. Hope you're well. Jumping on to do another video related to the pillars, or some of the things that I perceive as pillars of supersessionism, or pillars of replacement theology, and because it has a pretty long history, and for some of us, it's quite absurd to imagine that supersessionism has continued quite this long. But so I wanted to highlight just a few of the pillars that have kind of undergirded the idea over the years. And I, of course, did. We had the video recently about New Testament priority. And today I want to talk about something that may seem unrelated, but I want to talk about why was the temple destroyed in AD 70? And that might seem like a really trivial question, but but the reason is that it's even worth asking, because not everything's worth asking, and certainly not everything worth making a video on. I mean, there are certainly serious things going on in the world right now. But is the way you answer that question actually determines a lot about what you think or how you see God acting towards the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So let me say this to begin with. There are basically three views. Three views related to how or why the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And the first one is just the bad things happen, so to speak. It's basically that the destruction of the temple has no inherent meaning. This is almost like a deist view, right? That God just kind of lets things play out and they don't have meaning except for men are evil. And that is, I mean, I understand the view, but this is almost a view that attempts to minimize the historical relevance of it. And that just doesn't seem like a very reasonable explanation. In my view, if you believe the Tanakh, that is not at all a rational explanation. So in the second view is that, and this is actually very popular right now, in a lot of denominations, this is kind of as a whole, this is how they think about it, is that God was done with the old system of Judaism. And nothing represents the system of Judaism like the temple. I mean, it's geographically and ethnically exclusive. It's not everywhere. It's only in the land of Israel. And it's not stewarded by the Irish or by the Ethiopians. It's stewarded by the Jew. And so that system, in this view, God was simply done with it. So he lifted his hand of protection, or he raised up the Romans, however you view it, to demonstrate to the world that they should abandon ship and jump on with the new things God's doing, called Christianity. And the new thing, of course, was the exact opposite. It was not exclusive and ethnically, localized in the land of Israel. It was universal. It was not geographically based. And so the new thing was what God was doing, and he's not into the old thing, which is the exact opposite. And and that brings us to the third point. And the third point is that it was a judgment from God. It was a judgment from God. And interestingly, that view, as harsh as that sounds, that's actually a view that's shared by Christians and by much of the Jewish community. Theologically speaking, the Jews, Orthodox Jews, have been handed down a tradition from the Talmud that definitely acknowledges that the temple was destroyed because of God's anger towards the nation of Israel in the first century. And so what we have there is an obvious difference on what caused God to be angry, right? Why was God's judgment Why did God's judgment fall on the nation and on the temple in AD 70? And the Christian answer, and we'll get to the Jewish answer in a second, but the Christian answer is, generally speaking, because of their rejection of Jesus. Their rejection of Jesus. And so I'd like to highlight just a couple of points on why I don't think this is a good view. And none of these points have to do with the fact that it hurts Jews' feelings to say that. If it's true, then it's true. I just don't happen to think it's true. So, number one, it really obscures the fact that the gospel spread around the world not because of a bunch of Gentile Christians, but because of a bunch of Jews who accepted the testimony of Jesus and, at the expense of their own lives, spread it across the known earth at the time. And they weren't the only ones. It wasn't only 12 men, right? There were thousands and thousands. In the first 3 chapters of the book of Acts, we have 8,000, I think, alone. 8,000 men. The first 4 chapters. 4 chapters, I think. 8,000 Jews, in addition to those who had already joined during Jesus' lifetime. And then later in Acts 21, when Paul visits James, James tells him, I want you to see how many thousands and thousands of the priests have come to follow Jesus. And so the idea that they rejected Jesus is a little bit overstated. Very overstated, in fact. This is not to minimize that there was serious sin that took place around the crucifixion of Jesus. Bearing false witness in a trial, which the term bearing false witness from the 10 Commandments isn't probably about lying, guys. I know that's going to be really rough on the Sunday school messages, but it's probably a technical term about giving a false testimony in a trial. And so bearing false witness, that's not the only reference in the Torah. It's referenced throughout. The person who gives a false witness about something actually will get the punishment that the defendant was accused, or that is being brought against the defendant. And so there's no question that a false witness was brought against Jesus. And that's a very serious crime, but it's a crime by those men who did it. It's not a crime by the whole nation. God doesn't work that way. And that brings me to the second point, is that it assumes that God counts every Jew for all of time guilty for this sin. And plenty of places in the Torah and in the prophets, it's actually a prominent theme in the book of Ezekiel, explain God doesn't do that. That's not a just way to act. God doesn't kill the sons because of the sins of the father. And so not only would we have to accept that God decided to judge the sons for the sins of their father, but it's literally judging the sons for the sins of the father, because ironically, the temple was destroyed about 40 years after the death of Jesus. Why is 40 years symbolic, or why did I say it's ironic? Because you remember back in the wilderness period when that generation sinned and he wanted to purge the congregation of Israel from the sinful generation, how long did he have to wait to purge out that generation of rebels so that he could basically enter in with a new group that wasn't guilty of that rebellion? 40 years. So it's interesting that after 40 years here, we still have supposedly God counting the sin of rejecting Jesus on the entire nation. So all of these things kind of, and if you go through the book of Acts and even through some of the letters, there are definite statements of Jewish guilt. But number one, the ones in the book of Acts are always those who are guilty in the earlier sections of Acts. Those who are guilty of killing the Messiah were always Jewish men in Jerusalem who were likely present either at his crucifixion or at the chant of crucify him, crucify him. There were very particular men. It wasn't that Paul went into every synagogue in the diaspora. You don't find Paul going into every diaspora synagogue and telling them all that they're guilty for the death of a Jewish man in the land of Israel. Doesn't even come up. So those don't make any sense to me either. So that brings us to the Jewish view. And the Jewish view is, again, been handed down in the tradition from the Talmud in Tractate Yoma. Tractate Yoma 9b, chapter 9b, we find that there's a conversation, and they say, why was the first temple destroyed? And the first temple was destroyed for obvious reasons, because all the prophets explained, right? Idolatry, immorality, social injustice were rampant. That's just the way it was. These men were not devoted to the God of Israel, and it was very easy to see. Then it raised the question with some of the other leaders there, some of the other sages, and they said, but the second temple period, the period around the second temple in the first century, they didn't call it the first century, but the Jewish people, the nation was unusually devout at that time. Participation in the prayers, generally speaking, there was a measure of righteousness in the nation, very different from the first temple period, before the destruction of the first temple, where some of the prophets say you're even filthier than some of the Gentile nations who've never even heard of the testimony of God. And so, but this one was different. And so the question was, well then, why did God judge the nation and give us over to our enemies and allow for the temple to be destroyed? And the answer, and this becomes kind of the punchline of the stories, the answer is called baseless. It's a translation would be baseless hatred, unreasonable hatred. And so some of the sages said the stories we know from that time are that the land of Israel was filled with baseless hatred. They were just very hateful. Sure, they paid their tithes and they went to prayers, but they were just hateful. And it got to the point where God couldn't allow his covenant people, who are called to be a light to the nations, to highlight to the nations what he's like. He couldn't let them go on like this anymore. And so he brought his judgment. And so one of the things I think this reveals is the destruction of the temple, I think, properly seen, ought to reveal that God is still very much in covenant with the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham. And God cares very much about the land of Israel, and God even cares very much about the temple. All of the language in the New Testament is very positive about the temple. It's not very positive about how the temple is being run at the time, the Sadducee problem, but that's a story for another video. But the apostles, after ingesting the teachings of Jesus for 3.5 years, are still going daily into the temple for prayers when they relocate to Jerusalem after Jesus' ascension. So there's no conflict there. So what we have then is the destruction of the temple is rather a sign of God's commitment to maintaining the terms of the covenant, which in itself is a commitment to the covenant. It's not apathy. It's not disregard. It's actually the expression of God's commitment to continue in the covenant. And so therefore, the terms of the covenant already outlined in the Torah, right? Outlined Deuteronomy 28, 32, Leviticus 26. These terms of the covenant are already in place, and the fact that he's still walking out these terms of the covenant is an indicator to us that God is still in covenant with that people. And so then you have like commentary in 2 Maccabees 6, where they talk about how to view God's dealings with the nation of Israel. And the author of 2 Maccabees says, we have to be aware that God doesn't deal with our sins the way he deals with the nations. So with the nations, he lets their sin rise until it's completely full, but then he has to judge them severely. With us, he doesn't let it get full. He doesn't let it get to that point. He judges us quickly because he's not willing to let us be completely blotted out as a nation. So that brings me to the last point. If that's the case, the second temple definitely had prophets calling the people out on idolatry, immorality, and social justice. That's what the prophetic period was about, really. And so what about this period? Did we have any prophets that God sent if he's so committed to the covenant? And in this context, I just like to highlight the teachings of Jesus. I just like to highlight how uniquely the teachings of Jesus address issues of hatred and call the Jewish people to love and forgive one another. And I specifically have in mind like the end of chapter 5 of Matthew, where he's going to say, turn the other cheek if you're compelled to walk 1 mile, walk 2. And he's going to say, if you only love those who love you, what good is that? Even the Gentiles do that. And so it's a very particular calling to the Jew there. He's actually highlighting his Jewish brothers, apparently speaking into this context that I think actually seems quite credible. That there was it was just a hateful generation. There was no love. Not no love, but it was a very loveless generation. And so he's calling them out specifically. He says, look at your Father in heaven. He sends rain on the just and the unjust and causes the sun to shine on the righteous and the wicked. Now, you do good to those who do evil to you. Pray for those who hate you, so that you can be sons of your Father who are in heaven. All that to say, I want to bring this all back around now and say, one, I think that it was a judgment from God, and it expresses his ongoing commitment to the covenant, number one. Number two, I think it was because of baseless hatred. I really do think the rabbis were right. And I think that the words of the prophet Jesus, we know more than a prophet, he's the Messiah, but the words of that prophet sent to that generation, calling them to love and forgiveness and turning the other cheek and blessing and praying for their enemies, so that specifically not acting like the Gentiles, so that they could be that city on a hill, the light that can't be placed under a bushel, that the testimony of what the God of Israel is like would actually be seen amongst their people. And I think that God has essentially decided, I won't have it any other way. I'm going to ensure that they are a faithful witness to what I'm like to the nations of the earth. And in that generation, the baseless hatred could not be reconciled with his character. And so we had the judgment, but we know redemption is coming, and the God of Israel will be vindicated, his covenant will be vindicated, and all will know of his ongoing, steadfast, unshakable commitment to his covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And I think that seeing AD 70 and the destruction of the temple in this light is quite crucial for understanding the narrative of the Bible. If you see it wrong, the narrative of the Bible is severed, and then a new narrative has to begin. And I just don't think that's necessary. I think that us Gentiles, I'm Irish, and I think that God's love for me is absolutely has room in the language of the prophets and in the language of the Tanakh and, in the language of the apostles, even with an ongoing commitment to the election of Israel. And so I hope that this is encouraging, and I hope you can kind of find how I'm trying to navigate this question of replacement theology and some of the pillars that have historically undergirded these ideas. So as always, you can leave comments below or questions if you have them, and I'll get back with them as soon as I can. But Lord be with you all. Peace.